history insofar as they were involved. In other words, it is a history of Milwaukee's founders, not of Milwaukee itself. But first, a few acknowledgements. I would like to thank John Gerda for his book, The Making of Milwaukee, Goodwin Berquist and Paul C. Bowers Jr. for their book, Byron Kilbourne and the Development of Milwaukee, and the Encyclopedia of Milwaukee, which is produced and made available by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. In addition to these core sources upon which my presentation is based, I would also like to acknowledge the previous versions of this talk on Milwaukee's founders created and presented by my colleagues Steve Schaffer and Juliet Hills. This presentation has been principally illustrated by photographs and other images from the collections of the Milwaukee County Historical Society Research Library. MCHS, pictured here, is where I work and is located in the former Second Ward Savings Bank on the corner of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Drive and Kilbourne Avenue in downtown Milwaukee. Several clippings from the comprehensive database of the Milwaukee Journal and Sentinel newspapers are also included, which were digitized and made available thanks to the Milwaukee Public Library. A handful of public domain and freely licensed images from other sources appear as well, and each of these images will be credited as it is shown. As an overview, here are the three founders of Milwaukee listed together with their birth and death dates. Solomon Juneau, born 1793, died 1856. Byron Kilbourne, born 1801, died 1870. And George Walker, born 1811, died 1866. But first, a bit of background. This early map, created circa 1825, shows how the Milwaukee and Menominee rivers divided the land near what is now downtown Milwaukee into three distinct areas. Juneautown to the northeast, now Easttown, the eastern half of downtown. Kilbournetown to the northwest, now Westtown, the western half of downtown. And Walker's Point to the south. Native Americans, including the Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee, lived in the area prior to European contact, mostly on hills relatively close to the rivers. Note the location of an Indian village, quote unquote, on this map in the Menominee River Valley, towards the west. Also note the location of Solomon Juneau's house east of the Milwaukee River, along with his brother Pierre Juneau's house, just to the south of it, and Jacques Vieux's residence southwest of them in the Menominee River Valley. Before large-scale earth-moving commenced, what is now Milwaukee was hillier than it is today, while much of its lowland around the rivers comprised marshes. This later map depicts Milwaukee in 1835, showing substantially more development than the previous map. Note that north is to the right. Both white and Native American buildings are depicted on this map. Juneautown, center right, Kilbournetown, upper right, and Walker's Point, center left, are all labeled. The map is also adorned with small portraits of those three settlements' respective founders. Let us begin this presentation with Solomon Juneau, the founder of Juneautown, today's Easttown, who is often thought of as first among equals among Milwaukee's three founders. Solomon Juneau was born in 1793 in the small farming village of Repentigny in Lower Canada, now Quebec. Located close to Montreal, Juneau grew up near the nerve center of the French fur trade in North America. In 1808, while still a teenager, he became a voyageur, one of France's legendary canoe-traveling fur traders. He possibly worked for the famed Hudson's Bay Company, although there is no documentation to prove it. At this early stage in his career, he likely traveled as far as the Straits of Mackinac. After Juneau's career as a voyageur, which likely lasted the typical 3 years, he most likely then worked between Mackinac and the Mississippi River. In 1817, he was working as an independent agent at Prairie du Chien. In 1818, Juneau arrived in modern-day Milwaukee to work as the clerk and apprentice of Jacques Vieux, pictured as Vieux's log cabin, located in what is now Mitchell Park. Vieux was a French fur trader who had established a trading post along the Menominee River in 1795. In 1819, 1 year after Juneau's arrival in the area, View gave Juneau control of his trading agency. The next year, 1820, Juneau and View's Métis daughter Josette were married. As Solomon gained more experience, View began to give him more responsibilities. After apparently working elsewhere for a few years, Solomon and Josette Juneau returned to what is now Milwaukee in 1825 to work for the American Fur Company. They built a log cabin of their own located at what is now the corner of East Wisconsin Avenue and North Water Street. As a fur trader, Juneau was considered accomplished and highly competent by his peers. Standing roughly 6 feet tall, Juneau had, in the words of John Gerda, a wrestler's physique, quote unquote. He developed a reputation for dealing fairly and humanely with Native Americans, although he was also known for his ability to be stern. He spoke both Potawatomi and Menominee, at least conversationally, and he had particularly good relationships with these Native American nations. This drawing depicts Juneau trading with local Native Americans. Until the mid-1830s, Juneau and View still primarily resided in Green Bay, only living in what is now Milwaukee during the winters. However, as Bethany Harding notes, his nascent Juneautown settlement was already, by the mid-1830s, poised to eclipse Green Bay as the base for the region's fur market, quote unquote. During this period, the Juneau sent their children to boarding schools in both Green Bay and Detroit. For almost a decade, Juneau and View found success as fur traders in Milwaukee. However, even as early as the 1820s, beaver were becoming harder to find. This made the trade even more reliant on muskrat at a time when furs in general were falling out of fashion with upper-class Europeans. In the winter of 1831-32, a smallpox epidemic decimated local Native Americans. Because they played crucial roles in the fur trade, this inflicted further damage on the already struggling enterprise. At this point, View decided to retire to his farm outside of Green Bay. Juneau instead opted to try to ride out the lean years in Milwaukee, which made him the only fur trader in the settlement at the time. Pictured is a replica of Juneau's log cabin on display at Juneau Park in a photograph taken in 1998. In 1831, as American settlement advanced towards Milwaukee, Juneau decided to become an American citizen and begin learning English. By this point, he had also begun his involvement in town site development and real estate speculation, which diversified his business beyond the fur trade and sales from his general store. Pictured here is an 1845 advertisement in the Milwaukee Sentinel that Juneau placed for his general store. In 1839, Juneau reported quote-unquote tolerable levels of trade with Native Americans who were resisting American attempts to expel them from their lands to west of the Mississippi River. However, in 1843, just 3 years later, the situation had changed for the worse, and Juneau wrote, "The fur trade is of no consequence in this place, being but very few Indians here," quote unquote. In the words of Gerda, Juneau, pictured here, was an old voyageur who, more by accident than design, became a charter member of the crew that built a city on the swamp, quote unquote. By the mid-1830s, he would be joined by a select group of other prominent early Milwaukeeans. Arriving in 1833 was Morgan Martin, a New York lawyer who would become Juneau's business partner. In 1834, Byron Kilbourne of Connecticut, via Ohio, and George Walker of Virginia, via Illinois, had also arrived, and both were to become rivals and occasional allies of Juneau. Then, in 1835, a relatively large group of approximately 200 people came to Milwaukee in their footsteps, marking the beginning of significant white settlement in the area. Gerda describes Morgan Martin as the fourth member of a trio, quote unquote. Here's an 1866 portrait painting of him. Martin is not often given credit as being a founder of Milwaukee, and when he is, he's often a mere footnote or an accomplice to Juneau. Regardless, Gerda argues that Martin was instrumental in Juneau's evolution from a backcountry fur trader to perhaps the leading businessman and civic leader in a developing metropolis. Juno and Martin ultimately combined their skills and resources to share a fortune and an enduring friendship with each other. Martin was born in 1805 in the upstate settlement of Martinsburg, New York. He moved to Green Bay in 1827 to open a law practice in the then heavily French Canadian community, and he remained a resident of Green Bay for the rest of his life. In October 1833, Martin met Juno and proposed an alliance based on Juno's sole property claim to the area east of the Milwaukee River and Martin's extensive knowledge of real estate and the law. Pictured is a map of Milwaukee that Martin himself drew in 1833. Like Byron Kilbourne, as we shall see later, Martin was primarily attracted to Milwaukee due to its potential to be a port city that could ship agricultural products from Wisconsin's interior. Martin is quoted as saying that Juno's first hint of the prospective value of his location at Milwaukee came from me, quote unquote. Juno agreed to a partnership with Martin, in large part because his fur trade business was rapidly diminishing. In October 1833, Juno agreed to sell half of his land to Martin for $500. The sale of those land holdings ultimately created the wealth of both men and launched Juno's political career. Martin would also ultimately serve in politics as well, as in 1845, he was elected as the delegate of the Wisconsin Territory, pictured in this November 14, 1845 Milwaukee Sentinel newspaper clipping. Despite Yankees, Anglo settlers in Milwaukee from New England or New York, viewing Juno, pictured here, as a rustic and many perceiving him as being too trusting and too impulsive, his fur trading skills translated into real estate skills very effectively. Furthermore, his grasp of the English language was good enough to write decent letters on his own by 1837. In January 1835, Martin and Juno convinced federal crews to survey what is now the central part of Milwaukee, establishing property lines that exist to this day. After the completion of the survey, Martin and Juno divided their land holdings into lots and began selling them. In July 1835, Juno exercised his preemption claim to the land he lived on at a public land sale in Green Bay, paying a total of $165 for 133 acres that today comprise the heart of downtown. This land was bound on the north by Juno Avenue, on the east by Broadway Avenue, the south by Wisconsin Avenue, and the west by 6th Street. Pierre Juno similarly exercised his preemption on 157 acres that became what is now the historic 3rd Ward, property that he soon combined with Solomon Juno's and Martin's holdings. This map shows the Junotown settlement in pink, including both today's historic 3rd Ward as well as Easttown. 1835 was also the year that Joe Oliver arrived in Milwaukee, mentioned here in this November 6, 1994 article in the Milwaukee Journal. Oliver was likely the first African-American in the area, and he came to the settlement to work for Solomon Juno. Oliver had previously been employed as a cook on ships sailing the Great Lakes. He was also able to vote in the first election in Milwaukee, before the Wisconsin Territory disenfranchised him along with other people of color and quote-unquote paupers, idiots, and lunatics. Juno and Martin did not hesitate to become involved in both civics and politics in Junotown. In 1835, Juno was appointed the first postmaster of Milwaukee, as well as its first superintendent of the poor, quote unquote, in which role he provided food, firewood, and occasionally housing to those in need. The next year, 1836, he and Martin built the first Milwaukee County Courthouse, pictured on the site of today's Cathedral Square. Also that year, they opened the first hotel in the city at the corner of Wisconsin and Broadway, the Milwaukee Hotel, also known as the Bellevue House. In 1837, Juno helped to launch an early newspaper, the Milwaukee Sentinel, and in 1839, the first Catholic church in Milwaukee, St. Peter's, was built on land donated by Juno. In 1836, Juno and Martin hired a New Yorker named Nelson Olin to grade Wisconsin Avenue all the way from the Milwaukee River to Lake Michigan. The following year, they hired James Buck and a crew of laborers to begin the process of leveling the bluffs east of the Milwaukee River, using the soil from the bluffs to fill in portions of the marsh that existed in the Third Ward. This early view of Juneautown likely depicts the settlement shortly after the leveling for Wisconsin Avenue. Note the height of the bluffs at the time. Martin later calculated that he and Juneau spent more than $100,000 on grading and leveling. Morgan Martin remained in Green Bay for the rest of his life, never moving to Milwaukee to live permanently as Juneau did. Martin believed, like many in Brown County at the time, that Milwaukee would never surpass Green Bay in population or economic importance. Juneau continued to work as a fur trader into the late 1830s, but by that point, this work was very much secondary to real estate for him. Gerda describes Juneau's role at the time as, quote unquote, a one-man hospitality committee, welcoming visitors and dispensing both jobs and advice to any number of newcomers. Despite the physical distance between Juneau and Martin, their friendship and trust in each other never wavered, as demonstrated by this April 14, 1845 letter from Martin to Juneau. Their partnership was foundational to their collective prosperity, and at the peak of the real estate boom, Juneau was reported to have a net worth of over $100,000. Josette View Juneau, pictured in this portrait here, the future wife of Solomon Juneau, was born circa 1804 in Green Bay. She was Métis, a biracial person of Native American and French ancestry, who was born to a Menominee mother and a French-Canadian father, Jacques View. Because of her father's seasonal work in what would become Milwaukee, she grew up both there and in Green Bay. Josette's father hired voyageur Solomon Juneau to work for him in 1818, and she married Solomon in 1820. Because Josette was fluent in both French and multiple Native American languages, and her husband Solomon was only fluent in French, she often served as an interpreter for him. She also ran the trading post when he was gone on trips to trade with local Native Americans. In 1835, Josette pictured, and Solomon Juneau and their family moved into one of the first frame buildings in Milwaukee, on the corner of Water and Michigan. She had 8 children by that point, and would ultimately raise 14 children in all. Despite her domestic responsibilities, she also served as a hostess, midwife, and nurse to the growing number of women in the community. In the words of Morgan Martin, Josette Juneau was, quote unquote, a most amiable and excellent woman, and many of the first settlers around Milwaukee will no doubt bear ample testimony to the deeds of charity by which she was distinguished. New settlers described her with such terms as high courage, brave presence, and queenly presence, quote unquote. These settlers also largely credited Josette's calm and stoical self-possession, quote unquote, for saving the frontier settlement by mediating peace with aggrieved Potawatomi contemplating an attack on white settlers, although this famous tale is possibly apocryphal. Regardless, the story emphasizes the importance that Métis women played as cultural mediators between the white world of their husbands and the native world of their people. Such marriages helped to build economic alliances, develop tribal trade networks, and often were consummated for religious reasons, mainly becoming Catholics. Pictured is a reproduction of a painting depicting Josette and Solomon Juneau's wedding. In 1848, Josette and Solomon moved to the rural settlement of Teresa, Wisconsin, pictured in this circa 1907 public domain photograph from the collections of the Wisconsin Historical Society. Genevieve G. McBride argues that more than his politics, it was their religion and her racial identity as Métis that had made them less welcome in Milwaukee by the mid-19th century than they had been initially. In 1852, however, Solomon and Josette Juneau returned to Milwaukee to pursue medical care for her, but she died that year. He would die the following year. Juneau, this is a later portrait of him, and Martin were profoundly affected by the Panic of 1837. Martin was a principal in Green Bay's Bank of Wisconsin, which floundered in 1837 before ultimately collapsing in 1839. Eliminating a large portion of his wealth. Juneau was also paying high overhead costs while earning less revenue due to both inflation and quickly declining land values caused by the panic. The economic malaise was perhaps best illustrated by the tale of Juneau's then newest investment, the steamboat Milwaukee. Launched in 1838, it ran aground in 1841, ultimately being dismantled without earning any profit at all. However, the panic did not weaken Juneau and Martin's friendship, nor did it harm Juneau's good reputation among his peers or even his rival, Byron Kilbourne. Pictured here is a receipt from Juneau from a purchase at the Daggett and Richardson Variety Store on East Water Street in 1847. In 1837, Juneau was selected president of the new town of Milwaukee upon its formation that year, although it only consisted of his settlement east of the Milwaukee River. In 1839, after coexisting independently for the previous 2 years, it merged with Kilbourne's West Side town to become the combined town of Milwaukee. Juneau also served as the Milwaukee County Register of Deeds and was on the board of directors of Kilbourne's ill-fated Milwaukee and Rock River Canal Company. After the city of Milwaukee was incorporated on January 31st, 1846, Solomon Juneau was elected its first mayor. Pictured is his name listed as the Democratic candidate for mayor in the April 4th, 1846 Milwaukee Sentinel. Juneau had not campaigned for the office, though, and left most of the actual mayoral duties to John B. Smith, an alderman from Juneautown, who is also listed on this newspaper clipping. As Goethe put it, despite his reluctance to govern, Juneau was an obvious choice for the mayor's post, quote unquote. One reason was that he was much less partisan than many of his contemporaries, especially Kilbourne. Newcomers to the city also often revered him, largely because they regarded him as their only real connection to the settlement's primitive frontier days. By 1846, the rapidly developing community already had a population of nearly 10,000 people and was urbanizing quickly. In Goethe's words, Mayor Juneau served most effectively as a symbol of how far Milwaukee had come, quote unquote. In another famous role as a dignitary, on November 20th, 1850, Juneau was a passenger on the first Milwaukee and Mississippi Railroad train from Milwaukee to Wauwatosa. The Milwaukee Sentinel wrote that he expressed much astonishment, quote unquote, about traveling on Kilbourne's new railroad at the then astounding speed of 30 miles an hour. Pictured is an excerpt from a 1936 Sentinel retrospective article that includes this passage from the newspaper's original 1850 coverage of Juneau's train trip. In 1848, just 2 years after Milwaukee had been incorporated as a city and he had been elected its mayor, Juneau decided to leave for a more rural location in Dodge County, where the Fond du Lac Road crossed the Rock River. There, he founded a settlement he named Teresa, in honor of both his mother and his eldest daughter. Pictured here is the Juneau Homestead and Museum in Teresa. Juneau lived most of the rest of his life there, once again actively involved in the fur trade while also operating a grist mill and a variety store. Native Americans remained settled in the vicinity around Teresa, due in part to Juneau's presence, until the federal government expelled them to Kansas in 1851. On November 14th, 1856, Juneau had an attack of undetermined nature, quote unquote, and died while trading on the Menominee Reservation. His remains were returned to Milwaukee, and St. John's Cathedral, pictured, hosted his funeral, which was the best attended in city history. He was initially buried at the Catholic Cemetery near 22nd Street and Wisconsin Avenue, but when that site was later redeveloped, his remains were reinterred in Calvary Cemetery. When Juneau moved to what is now Milwaukee in 1833, he was one of only a handful of white people in the area. By his death in 1856, the settlement had become a city with over 40,000 people. In the words of John Goethe, with Solomon Juneau was buried in, for all practical purposes, the frontier, quote unquote. This photo is of the Juneau Monument in Juneau Park. Now, let us turn to the second man of our trio, Byron Kilbourne, Juneau's great rival and his occasional ally. Byron Kilbourne was born to James and Lucy Fitch Kilbourne in Connecticut in 1801, but he grew up in Worthington, Ohio, a suburb of Columbus. In the words of John Gerda, Byron Kilbourne was dour, daunting, and determined to have his way, quote unquote. Kilbourne even bluntly described his modus operandi in an 1835 letter to Morgan Martin, in which he wrote, "Liberality, generosity, and such like sentiments I discard from business affairs," quote unquote. Regardless, he was an industrious and highly productive man, and in the words of Thomas J. Jablonski, he had the most ambitious and comprehensive dreams, quote unquote, of any of Milwaukee's three founders. Kilbourne understood the crucial importance of transportation, as well as how to capitalize on opportunity. However, as Jablonski put it, his civic-mindedness was always tempered by the desire for personal gain and by a hesitation to seek success as a team endeavor, quote unquote. As Kilbourne's contemporary, Dr. Lucius I. Barber, wrote in 1835, he was a man of strong prejudices and dictatorial disposition, at all times insistent upon having his own way, and consequently not popular, quote unquote. Kilbourne's father, James, had initially been successful as a manufacturer of woolen clothing, and before he declared bankruptcy, Byron was benefiting from a quality education. However, after his father's change in fortunes, Byron was compelled to start working for himself at age 16 or 17. He became employed as a surveyor, a key profession for the mapping and settlement of the then booming Midwestern United States. In the 1820s, Kilbourne also became involved in the construction and maintenance of both the Miami Canal and the Ohio Canal, the latter pictured here in this 1902 public domain photograph from the Western Reserve Historical Society and Cuyahoga Valley National Recreation Area. Between 1827 and 1834, Kilbourne superintended virtually every aspect of canal construction and maintenance, quote unquote, in the words of his biographers, Goodwin Berquist and Paul C. Bowers, Jr. Possibly portending future events, they also noted that in canal service, the line between private interest and public service was not sharply defined, quote unquote. Kilbourne had returned to surveying by the spring of 1834 at the latest. He ultimately worked for Micah Williams, the Surveyor General of the Northwest Territory, pictured in this 1819 portrait painting by an unknown artist now at the Cincinnati Museum Center. Williams was, in the words of Berquist and Bowers, the one man in the world Byron most admired, respected, and trusted, quote unquote. In 1827, Kilbourne married Mary Cowles. She never recovered her health after the birth of their second child, ultimately dying of pneumonia in 1837. Kilbourne's second wife was Henrietta Carrick, pictured, the daughter of a wealthy merchant from Baltimore. 3 of Kilbourne's 4 children, including those from his first marriage, did not survive into adulthood, leaving only Byron Hector Kilbourne, who would go on to serve as a lieutenant in the Union Army during the Civil War. In 1834, Micah J. Williams sent Kilbourne to Wisconsin, at the time the western portion of the Michigan Territory, where he first surveyed public lands near Manitowoc. Kilbourne became Williams' partner in business, and he searched Wisconsin's Lake Michigan shoreline for the best potential town site. He traveled all the way from Chicago to Green Bay before deciding upon modern-day Milwaukee as the most promising location, pictured here in this drawing depicting the lakefront shortly after the beginning of white settlement. From the beginning, Kilbourne saw the commercial advantages of Milwaukee, especially its potential as a trading center for farmers from Wisconsin's interior. In Gerda's estimation, it was the potential of the harbor, more so than any natural resources in the immediate area, that drew Kilbourne to Milwaukee. Jablonski describes Kilbourne's vision of modern-day Milwaukee being a pivotal transit point between the established regions of the East Coast and America's seemingly unbounded western frontiers, quote unquote. While Juneau focused on the east side of the Milwaukee River, pictured in this lithograph from circa 1872, due to its proximity to Lake Michigan, Jablonski argues that Kilbourne envisioned more future greatness on the west side of the settlement. It offered the potential for direct, albeit distant, access to the Mississippi River and had strong overall economic potential. With Juneautown already having been occupied by 1834, Kilburn, pictured, turned his attention to the land west of the Milwaukee River. He saw it for the first time in November 1834. That year, he became a professional land speculator with $8,500 to invest. As Jablonski puts it, while on the one hand, Kilburn worked assiduously to promote Milwaukee's land sales and population development, on the other hand, he undertook those efforts steadfastly and for his own benefit first and foremost, quote unquote. In his estimation, Kilburn saw Juneau and Martin as the opposition to be challenged at every point, quote unquote. Juneau and Martin had clear title to the east side of the river due to a cession made by the Menominee Nation. However, due to an 1833 treaty signed in Chicago, what would become Kilburntown on the west side of the river was still owned by the Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Ottawa until 1838. As Goethe put it, though, Kilburn had a gift for evading technicalities, and this case was no exception, quote unquote. He persuaded Micah J. Williams to allow him to include the west side in his land survey, the necessary first step before a public land sale. Pictured is an 1835 Milwaukee Journal article mentioning Kilburn's work platting out his settlement in 1835. Kilburn and Williams signed a formal partnership in May 1835, essentially mirroring Juneau and Martin's working relationship on the east side of the river. When the land went on sale in Green Bay in October 1835, Kilburn again acted unscrupulously, abusing the system of floating rights. Discussed here as part of the key year of 1835 in this retrospective 1930 Milwaukee Journal article by C.V. Wick Salomon. Floating rights were designed to protect settlers who claimed the same land as others, but Kilburn used them to file claims for land in Green Bay and then apply them to land he wanted in Milwaukee, in the process evicting white settlers already living on said land in Milwaukee. To secure his title to these dubiously acquired lands, he journeyed to Washington, D.C. to secure a federal patent for the land, which gave him control of more than a mile of property along the western bank of the Milwaukee River. Berquist and Goodwin observed that, initially, Byron used his own money in land speculation, but Williams suggested that he shift from personal investment to serving as an agent for absentee landowners, quote unquote. Kilburn would gain most of his wealth by buying and selling Milwaukee property. In early 1835, Juneau and Martin proposed merging their real estate interests with Kilburn's, but he declined. Kilburn went forward instead with building his own separate, self-sufficient settlement on the west side of the river, Kilburntown, pictured in this drawing. It was centered on his house, a general land office, a general store, a warehouse, and a hotel, the American House. All these buildings were on or immediately near to Chestnut Street, now ironically named Juneau Avenue. Kilburn lost the battle for the county courthouse to Juneautown, but he did succeed in establishing the first newspaper in the area, the Milwaukee Advertiser. Established in 1836, it predated Juneau's Milwaukee Sentinel by a year. Kilburn then largely occupied himself with landfill and street leveling, which was an even more extensive undertaking in Westtown than what Juneau had to do east of the river. Goethe argues that there was no personal enmity in Kilburn's scheming, quote unquote, observing he used Morgan Martin's legal services and asked Solomon Juneau to serve on the board of his canal company. Instead, Goethe describes Kilburn as having a competitive zeal that verged on nastiness, quote unquote. Examples of this include his construction of a bridge over the Menominee River to divert new arrivals from Walker's Point to Kilburntown, as well as the operation of the steamships Badger and Detroit, which only docked on Kilburn's west side, not in Juneautown or Walker's Point. Kilburn even refused to lay out the street grid for Kilburntown in alignment with Juneautown, which led to the bridges across the Milwaukee River downtown being constructed at odd angles, a notable quirk that is visible to this day. Pictured is a 1910 Sanborn fire insurance map showing the non-aligned street grid and these odd-angled bridges. North is to the right on this map. While Goethe concedes that there might have been rivalries in any case, he stresses that Kilburn undoubtedly aggravated Milwaukee sectionalism, quote unquote. While George Walker remained neutral and Juneau a non-combatant, quote unquote, in the words of Goethe, Byron Kilbourne remained a fierce partisan, quote unquote, when it came to rivalries between the pioneer settlements. Famously, in 1836, Kilbourne published a map that omitted any evidence of human habitation in Juneautown, pictured here, showing the entire east side as blank despite it being a thriving settlement. In the late 1830s and early 1840s, the most important dispute between Juneautown and Kilbournetown related to bridges. Juneautown residents essentially wanted bridges to connect them to other parts of what is now Milwaukee and give them better access to the rest of Wisconsin, while Kilbournetown endeavored to deny them such access. Kilbourne's long-term strategy was to deny passage to Juneautown in the hopes that he could ultimately make it a satellite of Kilbournetown. This thinking, however, ignored the reality that Kilbournetown residents went to the courthouse, post office, and churches in Juneautown, and that bridges between the two settlements also would serve Juneautown's needs, would serve Kilbournetown's needs by drawing people and business to Kilbournetown, not just for Juneautown. As Goethe put it, in the 1840s, however, each side found it easy to believe that any blow to its rival was a boost to its own fortunes, quote unquote. Pictured is a 1910 Milwaukee Sentinel article about the confusion caused by separate street naming conventions in Juneautown, Kilbournetown, and Walker's Point, at the time still an enduring legacy of early sectionalism in what is now Milwaukee. Streets were renamed in an attempt to rationalize the city's street grid in 1929. The rivers were originally crossed by small boats that travelers had to row themselves, which were replaced by a private ferry service in 1837. In 1840, the Wisconsin legislature required Milwaukee County to build a good and substantial drawbridge, quote unquote, over the Milwaukee River at Chestnut Street, today's Juneau Avenue, pictured in this drawing. Kilbourne's Milwaukee Advertiser was outraged by this requirement, writing, "We have never heard of a more high-handed act of injustice perpetrated against the undoubted right of the people," quote unquote. Kilbourne later said, with substantially more composure and greater perspective, that the history of this bridge squabble gives the political history of Milwaukee, quote unquote. In the 1840 territorial election, though, both seats for Milwaukee were won by candidates from Juneautown, and the bridge was built. Between 1842 and 1844, 3 more bridges were erected, 2 between Juneautown and Kilbournetown, at Spring Street, now Wisconsin Avenue, and Oneida Street, now Wells Street, and 1 between Juneautown and Walker's Point at Water Street, pictured as the Water Street Bridge circa late 19th century. Kilbourne and Kilbournetown residents at best viewed the bridges as a nuisance, and in March 1842, several West Siders opened the Chestnut Street Bridge in an attempt to cut off the link with Juneautown. At the May 7th, 1845 Town of Milwaukee Board meeting, pictured here are proceedings of which were published in the May 9th, 1845 Milwaukee Sentinel, Kilbourne himself presented a resolution to remove the western ends of all the bridges that crossed into Kilbournetown. The proposal was so bizarre and nonsensical that none of the other trustees would even vote on it. Taking matters into their own hands, the very next morning, Kilbournetown residents detached the west end of the Chestnut Street Bridge and dropped it into the Milwaukee River. An angry crowd of Juneautown residents soon gathered at the bridge, but for the moment, cooler heads prevailed. The village board met again that night without a quorum from Kilbournetown and authorized a $50 fine and 5-day jail sentence for anyone who vandalized a bridge. After the board, even including Kilbourne, voted to repair the Chestnut Street Bridge on May 15th, violence finally took place on May 19th. This time, it was sparked by Juneautown residents, destroying the Spring Street and Menominee River bridges, which link Kilbournetown with the road to Chicago. This was in an apparent attempt to cut off Kilbournetown from both the south and the east. Residents of Kilbournetown resisted physically, with the Sentinel reporting that 1 or 2 individuals were considerably injured, although not dangerously, quote unquote. Pictured is Charles Monagher's circa 1950 painting of the Bridge War, as this event has come to be called. Goethe hypothesizes that the bloodshed caused the community to reconsider their sectionalism, or at least the level of intensity it had risen to. As he put it, The Bridge War of 1845 ended in a truce and a city, quote unquote. On December 2nd, 1845, a group of leading citizens named Cross River Collaboration one of their most important projects, quote unquote. A meeting the following day formed committees to address various critical projects for the community, most important among them, at least in retrospect, being a city charter. The charter was drafted by December 27th, and in January 1846, it won a landslide victory in a vote, despite substantial opposition from Juneautown. Western townships of Milwaukee demanded independence as their price for cooperation, the result being the creation of Waukesha County. The territorial legislature then approved the charter, officially creating the city of Milwaukee on January 31st, 1846, 2 years before Wisconsin achieved statehood. Pictured is a draft city charter for the city of Milwaukee as published in the Milwaukee Sentinel on January 7th, 1845. In 1848, Kilbourne, ever interested in internal improvements and civic boosterism, tried to create the straight cut, quote unquote. A long-term goal of the community, this term refers to the artificial creation of a more direct path for the Milwaukee River to empty into Lake Michigan, about a half-mile north of its natural mouth. Kilbourne, without federal aid or assistance, employed a crew of laborers to dig a ditch across a narrow portion of the naturally occurring sandbar that separated the river from the lake. The very next storm, however, filled in the cut, and it would be until 1857 before a permanent and successful straight cut was completed. Pictured is a detail from an 1853 map showing a plan for the straight cut near the top and the natural mouth of the river near the bottom. Byron Kilbourne was always interested in transportation, which seems appropriate considering his maternal grandfather invented one of the first steamboats in the United States. Upon arriving in Milwaukee, Kilbourne served as an early road commissioner, grading roadways such as the Mukwonago Road. He was also a strong supporter of federal aid to develop Milwaukee's harbors, supporting small paddle wheel steamboats to connect the settlement to the coast before the straight cut was finally completed in 1857, pictured here in the circa 1860 drawing. Furthermore, Kilbourne was inspired by how Chicago built a canal to connect the Chicago River with the Illinois River and thus ultimately to the Mississippi River. He advocated for the same approach in Wisconsin, with his goal being a canal that linked the Milwaukee River with the Rock River, likewise connecting to the Mississippi River. With early support from both the United States Congress and the Wisconsin Territorial Legislature, Kilbourne began building his canal. However, lack of sufficient funds for construction and worsening perceptions of the canal project from both prominent politicians, most notably Governor James Doty, and settlers resulted in the project falling out of favor. Only a little over a mile of the canal was finished, pictured here near what is now Commerce Street. While it lost Kilbourne $30,000 and failed to become a key part of the area's transportation infrastructure, as Kilbourne had hoped, the aborted canal did become a key source of power for local industries and remained as such into the 1860s. It was the first true industrial area in the city, known simply as the water power, quote unquote. After the failure of his canal project, by the late 1840s, Kilbourne embraced the most revolutionary transportation technology of the era, railroads. As Goethe noted, he was never married to a single technology, quote unquote. In 1847, Kilbourne obtained a charter for the state's first railroad, the Milwaukee and Waukesha Railroad, soon renamed the Milwaukee and Mississippi, and he became its first president. Pictured as engine number 71 in Waukesha in 1851. It was built in 1848 and was the first operational locomotive in Wisconsin. Seeing the railroad as key to Milwaukee's struggle for regional supremacy with Chicago, Kilbourne's crews built the new railroad in 1849 and 1850, with the first two-car train being pulled by the locomotive Wisconsin on November 20th, 1850. In just 12 minutes, traveling at the then astounding speed of 30 miles an hour, the train traveled from Milwaukee to Wauwatosa. On February 25th, 1851, the railroad reached Waukesha. Kilbourne's West Side Depot in Milwaukee was located at 2nd Street and St. Paul Avenue, just 3 blocks from the present location of Milwaukee Intermodal Station. Kilbourne tried to Kilbourne tried to fraudulently replace the board members of the Milwaukee and Mississippi by selling a quote-unquote immense number of shares to those friendly to him at extremely low prices. When his scheme was exposed, however, he was promptly fired by the board at their January 1852 meeting. As his biographers put it, his desire to micromanage people and events led to his downfall, quote unquote. Just 3 months later, though, Kilbourne chartered a new railroad, the La Crosse and Milwaukee Railroad, stock certificate pictured. This time, he kept his involvement with the company a secret. As Goethe put it, Kilbourne's own reputation made the subterfuge necessary. In 1858, the La Crosse and Milwaukee reached the La Crosse River. While Kilbourne and other Milwaukeeans originally hoped that they could keep pace with Chicago via developing railroads, the Windy City eventually gained the upper hand due to a geographic advantage: direct railroad access to the eastern United States. As Goethe observes, Milwaukee's location 90 miles north of Chicago on the west coast of Lake Michigan was a marginal advantage in the age of sail that became a serious handicap in the age of rail, quote unquote, pictured in this 1865 public domain map of Wisconsin by Increase Lapham, which includes the state's railroads. The railroads were ultimately a double-edged sword, though. In addition to solidifying Chicago's place as a major freight handler, they also solidified Milwaukee's place as the dominant transportation and commercial hub in Wisconsin, and would also later prove instrumental to the growth of Milwaukee's brewing industry. The Cream City did not, as Kilbourne had once feared, wind up simply as a minor satellite of Chicago. Both the railroads that Kilbourne established, the Milwaukee and Mississippi and the La Crosse and Milwaukee, became key lines in the railroad empire that Alexander Mitchell would develop in the 1860s. Mitchell's railroad would eventually become the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, and Pacific, or more simply, the Milwaukee Road. Pictured is Milwaukee Road Class A 442 locomotive number 1 leaving Milwaukee Union Depot, circa 1940s, representing the peak of the railroad's existence. This photograph is from the Merck family collection. In addition to his career as a businessman, Kilbourne also made a lasting mark politically. He was elected to the territorial legislature in 1836, but he chose not to serve. He ran against future Governor James Doty for territorial delegate to Congress in 1839, but he won barely half the votes Doty did. Byron Kilbourne was twice elected mayor of Milwaukee for one-year terms, in 1848 and again in 1854. He was elected even though, as Jablonski put it, he was never a politician by nature because of his disinterest in wooing popular acclaim, quote unquote. Alongside being mayor of Milwaukee, his other major political achievement was being selected to serve as a delegate at the state's constitutional convention. In 1854, Kilbourne made a second run for the U.S. Senate, but lost to Charles Durkee of Kenosha by a single vote, illustrated here in this February 3rd, 1855 Milwaukee Sentinel article noting Durkee's election. As had happened during the Panic of 1837, Kilbourne was hit hard by the Panic of 1857. The financial crisis stopped operations on the La Crosse and Milwaukee Railroad, but soon Kilbourne created an even bigger problem for himself. He paid over $500,000 in railroad bonds to bribe the state legislature and Governor Coles Bashford in an attempt to win a land grant for railroad construction estimated to be worth over $17 million. Kilbourne, whom Goethe notes had always shown an impressive absence of scruples, quote unquote, defended his actions as necessary to prevent a Chicago-based railroad from obtaining the land grants. His defense was essentially that if he had not bribed the state government to give him the grant, it would have gone to out-of-state interests in Chicago. In the mid-1850s, railroad fever had swept the state, quote unquote, and many citizens were willing to overlook ethical breaches for the sake of development of Wisconsin railroads. But even other Wisconsinites viewed Kilbourne's attempted bribes as criminal, and he was lampooned nationally in this cartoon in Harper's Weekly in June 1858, pictured. When asked by investigators why he had made the bribe and why Governor Bashford, pictured in this public domain portrait by Matthew Brady from the Library of Congress, had accepted it, Kilbourne famously said, I believe he accepted it for the reason that he thought the company could well afford to make such a donation without doing it any material damage, while to him the sum was large enough to confer a real benefit, quote unquote. In other words, Kilbourne's reasoning was he had enough money to make a bribe, and the governor could use said money. Kilbourne did not even consider ethics, at least in this instance. Investigators' final report about the attempted bribery concluded that Kilbourne and the La Crosse and Milwaukee's managers were guilty of numerous and unparalleled acts of mismanagement, gross violations of duty, fraud, and plunder, quote unquote. Pictured is the first paragraph of an uncredited article entitled The Defense of Byron Kilbourne in the July 27, 1858 issue of the Milwaukee Sentinel, which mentions the report. There were no trials or convictions, however. While Kilbourne avoided prison, the La Crosse in Milwaukee entered bankruptcy in 1858, and his name and reputation were severely and irreparably damaged. In the words of Goethe, disgraced and discredited, Kilbourne saw his career as a public figure come to a rather inglorious end, quote unquote, comparing the final years of his life to Richard Nixon's isolated post-presidential existence. As Jablonski put it, nothing could blunt Kilbourne's ambitions and his need to keep busy, quote unquote. In the 1850s, before the bribery scandal and his public fall from grace, he had developed iron mines in Dodge County, established a college called Kilbourne University, and founded a new town on the Wisconsin River that he also named after himself, Kilbourne City. This name persisted until 1931, when it was renamed Wisconsin Dells. The 1870 public domain map of Kilbourne City pictured here is from the collection of the Wisconsin Historical Society. Both Kilbourne's mining interests and the settlement of Kilbourne City grew out of his railroads. Marred by accusations of fraud, however, Kilbourne's development of Kilbourne City is viewed by his biographers as further evidence of his aggressive opportunism, quote unquote. Byron Kilbourne was also notably involved in the local chapter of the Freemasons, and he consistently supported causes related to both fire prevention and higher education. He donated land for the construction of a reservoir, in part for use in firefighting, a body of water on a hill on North Avenue near the Milwaukee River that became known as the Milwaukee Reservoir, pictured in this 1931 aerial photograph by Albert F. Topfer. While the reservoir no longer survives, the land it was on is today Kilbourne Reservoir Park. As his biographers noted, however, Kilbourne's interest in internal improvements was unquestionably based on self-interest, quote unquote. In 1868, in the aftermath of the Civil War, Kilbourne left Milwaukee for Hot Springs, Arkansas, partially to treat his chronic rheumatism. He ultimately died in Jacksonville, Florida, where he operated a 450-acre citrus farm. He died there in his sleep on December 16, 1870. He was buried in Jacksonville until 1998, when Historic Milwaukee Incorporated repatriated his remains to Milwaukee and reinterred them in Forest Home Cemetery. Pictured is Kilbourne's headstone in Milwaukee. Regarding his legacy, his biographers argued whether you thought of Byron Kilbourne as a great man of vision or a great scoundrel depended upon the filter you use, quote unquote. But the truth is, he was quite clearly both. Pictured is a statue of Kilbourne. Finally, let us turn to the third man in our trio, probably the least celebrated, but still incredibly important in the early history of Milwaukee, George Walker. John Goethe describes Walker as finishing a distant third in the contest for pioneer supremacy in Milwaukee, quote unquote. George H. Walker was born in 1811 in Lynchburg, Virginia. When he was 14, he and his family moved to Gallatin, Illinois, in the southern part of the state. After briefly working in Chicago, where he traded with Native Americans, Walker moved to Milwaukee in March 1834 to start developing town sites. He settled on a minor peninsula about 300 yards long, located near the southern end of the present-day Water Street Bridge, a location that came to be called Walker's Point in his honor. There, he traded with local Native Americans. Like Juneau and Kilbourne, Walker had grand ideas about the development of a major metropolis in what is now Milwaukee, and he believed that his settlement would prove more popular and lucrative than either of theirs because of its location closer to the river's mouth. George Walker is pictured here in the carriage on the right in a reproduction of a 1944 Thorsten Lindbergh mural entitled Railroad Builder. Walker himself was unusually large for the time, weighing as much as 350 pounds. He was a jovial person known both as a graceful dancer and a skillful ice skater. However, his humor and personality may have also led to him being seen as less serious in business dealings, quote unquote, than either Juneau or Kilbourne. Walker, pictured, was more than 10 years younger than either Juneau or Kilbourne, and he lacked the powerful friends and access to capital that they had. He never had a partner like Morgan Martin or Micah J. Williams. Walker's land claim to what is now Walker's Point was jumped by a group of Green Bay residents during the infamous 1835 land sale. This forced Walker to abandon the log cabin he had built near the site of the current Water Street Bridge. Regrouping, he then claimed a different area, southwest of modern-day 6th and Pierce Streets. He also later bought back a portion of his, but at the price of $1,500 an acre, astronomically higher than the $1.25 per acre at which the government had sold it. Unfortunately for Walker, his situation became worse before it became better. In 1838, the federal government ruled that all lands south of the Milwaukee River were still owned by Native Americans through the end of the year, which invalidated the 1835 sale. This January 9, 1910 Milwaukee Journal article discusses Walker's inability to gain a preemption in the 1835 land sale. Goethe described the result as complete chaos, quote unquote, that made Walker's Point a no man's land with multiple groups of competing landowners and settlers. Walker's Point was too small to incorporate in 1837, unlike Juneautown and Kilbourne Town. Nonetheless, George Walker did play an active role in politics in the Wisconsin Territory, becoming Speaker of the Assembly in 1843. In 1842, Walker had finally gained clear title to his original claim, but it took him 3 more years to fully resolve his disputes with settlers and their legal claims. As Goethe puts it, Walker's Point never truly recovered from its slow start, quote unquote. It remained the smallest of the 3 pioneer settlements in Milwaukee by a considerable margin. In 1845, however, it had finally grown large enough to join the former Juneautown and Kilbourne Town as the South Ward in the growing town of Milwaukee. Pictured is a hand-drawn map of early Walker's Point. Note the large percentage of the settlement that was originally marshland. John Goethe hypothesizes that if George Walker had not encountered the numerous problems he did, Walker's Point very well could have developed into the heart of Milwaukee's downtown. Both Kilbourne Town and Juneautown were well upstream, and during the pioneer era, proximity to the river mouth was key to the development of a city. On top of this, Walker's Point was also more accessible to the overland trails to the south than either of the other 2 pioneering settlements. Plus, its access to the interior of Wisconsin was at least equal to that of Kilbourne Town's. Pictured is a late 19th century map of Milwaukee, with Walker's Point in the left foreground. North is to the upper right. Note Walker's Point's closer proximity to the harbor than either Kilbourne Town or Juneautown, which are both further up the Milwaukee River. Goethe concludes, geographic common sense ultimately made less difference than the aims and advantages of the individual founders, quote unquote. Juneau and Kilbourne were the dominant founders of Milwaukee, and they ensured that downtown Milwaukee became their 2 neighborhoods, a fact that remains true today. Ultimately, this meant that Milwaukee's principal area of development did not occur around the river mouth, as it had in Chicago, Racine, and Sheboygan, illustrated by this 1870 map of the central portion of Milwaukee. North is again to the right, with Walker's Point in the left center of the map, significantly closer to the harbor than either Juneautown or Kilbourne Town. Regardless of all the setbacks, Walker still succeeded in becoming a prominent citizen, financier, and politician in early Milwaukee. He served as one of 24 town supervisors in 1835 and in the territorial legislature as a Democrat from 1842 to 1845. As mentioned here as the president of the House in this January 13, 1845 article in the Milwaukee Sentinel. Furthermore, Walker served as registrar of the Milwaukee Land Office from 1845 to 1849 and as a state assemblyman in 1851. Walker's crowning political achievement was twice being elected mayor of Milwaukee, in 1851 and 1853. Pictured as Walker listed as mayor in an officers of the city listing in the November 14, 1851 issue of the Milwaukee Sentinel. After being elected for a second time in 1853, one of his signature priorities was the creation of a ferry service across Lake Michigan to Grand Haven. Walker declared, quite optimistically, that the new ferry route was destined to become the great thoroughfare for trade, travel, and emigration between the East and the West, quote unquote. The project remained a viable idea until the Panic of 1857, 4 years later. But Walker was ultimately ahead of his time in proposing a cross-lake ferry. By the late 1850s, moreover, there was no challenging Chicago's ascendant status as the freight handler of the nation, quote unquote, and its crucial role as the major transportation hub in the Midwestern United States. Regardless, Walker made meaningful contributions as both a politician and a leading citizen, including changing the city charter to reduce city taxes and limit municipal spending, serving on an early fire brigade, and petitioning the city council to allow a passenger railway to run into downtown. More generally, in the 1850s, he advocated for a road between Milwaukee and Waukesha and for railroads throughout Wisconsin. In 1860, Walker began operating the first horse-drawn streetcars in Milwaukee on East Water Street, pictured as a later horse-drawn streetcar, circa 1880, on the Grand Avenue, Wisconsin Avenue, and Wells Street line. In 1855, Walker's Point was still feeling the lingering effects of George Walker's title problems, as it accounted for less than 13% of Milwaukee's population at the time. However, its residents were quite diverse, including Bohemian, German, Irish, and Norwegian immigrants, in addition to Yankees who migrated from the eastern United States. Pictured is the Kroger Brothers Company on the corner of National Avenue and 6th Street, in the heart of Walker's Point, circa 1900. During the Civil War, the abolitionist movement in Milwaukee was very strong, and even transplanted Southerners like Walker were staunchly pro-union. After the end of the war, in 1866, Walker made his last contribution to civic life in Milwaukee, lobbying for the city's selection as one of 3 sites for national asylums, quote unquote, for Union veterans of the Civil War. This was a project organized by leading women in Milwaukee that was ultimately successful in creating the Milwaukee Soldiers' Home, pictured. It was completed in 1867, 1 year after Walker's death. George Walker died on September 20th, 1866, shortly after returning home from a trip to Washington, D.C., where he had been advocating on Milwaukee's behalf for the Soldiers' Home. The legacy of Milwaukee's 3 founders is now mostly one of place names that persist to this day. Juneautown and Kilburntown are today usually referred to as Easttown and Westtown, respectively, although their historic names are occasionally used. Walker's Point remains commonly known by its original name, arguably giving George Walker higher visibility in modern-day Milwaukee than either Solomon Juneau or Byron Kilbourne. Both Kilbourne and Juneau are memorialized with major east-west streets running through downtown that are named in their honor, Juneau Avenue being located 3 blocks north of Kilbourne Avenue. Perhaps fittingly, after the street name rationalization of 1929, they run continuously across both Easttown and Westtown. Kilbourne Avenue, as seen in this mid-20th century color photograph by Lyle Oberweis, is almost certainly the more important street, and it features impressive vistas of the current Milwaukee County Courthouse in Westtown, provides access to the Wisconsin Center, Auditorium, and Arena, also west of the river, and forms the northern boundary of Cathedral Square Park in Easttown before connecting to Juneau Park. Juneau Avenue also connects to Juneau Park on the east side, and it is now the northern boundary of Fiserv Forum on the west side. Juneau Park, pictured in this turn of the 20th century photograph, with its monument to Solomon Juneau and replica of his log cabin, remains a fixture along the lakefront and likely is the most famous of the parks named for the 3 founders. Kilbourne Reservoir Park, the site of Kilbourne's former reservoir, is located along the Milwaukee River on North Avenue between Holton and Humboldt Streets. It has been developed into a popular park of its own, known for its great views of the city skyline. And finally, the 1-block Walker Square Park honors George Walker's name at the corner of 9th and Washington Streets in Walker's Point. Thank you for attending my presentation. Does anyone have any questions?
Where was Walker buried?
Did you hear that? Where was Walker buried?
That's a good question. I did not see that in my research. I believe he was buried here in Milwaukee. Let me check that for you.
We have several questions, Michael. Do you want me to present them to you?
Yes, George H. Walker was buried here in Milwaukee, and his body is at Forest Home Cemetery.
Michael, somebody would like to ask you if you could suggest a particular book to find more about the three founders.
Yes. Really, the primary core source of this presentation was John Gerda's The Making of Milwaukee, which really covers city history very, very well as an introductory text. That's certainly the first place to look. There is a wonderful biography of Byron Kilbourne and the Development of Milwaukee by Bowers and Bergquist, which I used as well. There is not a biography of that level that I'm aware of either Juneau or Walker. There was a biography of Juneau written in the 50s or 60s that's really more for a juvenile audience. But I would highly recommend both Gerda's book and also Bowers and Bergquist's biography on Kilbourne.
Okay. The next question, in the last photo of your presentation showing the Milwaukee County Historical Society building, there was a road where there is now Pere Marquette Park. When did the park get put in?
Yes, that's a really good point. There was a row of buildings that was cleared, I believe, in the late 1960s, where Pere Marquette Park is now as part of urban renewal. And that's resulted in this building here being literally the only building within a few blocks either way, up till Old World 3rd Street on the north, and the Germania building probably on the south. Everything else around it has changed. But it was in the late 1960s or early 1970s when Pere Marquette Park was put in. You know, and it's really a beautiful addition to the building. It's sometimes hard to stand up here on the second floor looking out towards the park and believing that this building and the park weren't built with each other in mind, but they weren't. There was just another row of buildings along what was at the time West Water Street, now Plankinton Avenue, and that actually explains the odd shape of this building. It's a small triangular building because when it was built, there was a street on the east side, buildings across the street, as you mentioned. And so the small triangular shape of this building was quite literally constricted by streets on three sides when it was built in 1913.
Next question. Do you think other early cities also had multiple founders?
That's a good question. Probably. You know, a good example is New York City, which, you know, well into the 19th century, for instance, Brooklyn was an independent city. So New York City at that time was Manhattan and the Bronx, I believe. And it wasn't until I think the late 1890s when New York City was, as we know it today, was consolidated. So that's a really good example of a city that has kind of a similar history to Milwaukee's, that was unified even more recently than we were. I'm sure there are many other examples. There are many other examples of other major cities around the world. Budapest, which was originally separate cities of Buda and Pest in Hungary, is another example I know off the top of my head. But if you dig into the history of a lot of big cities, I would not be surprised if a lot of them have separate founders and grew out of separate settlements.
Okay, there's another question. Who took over Juneau's interest after his death? Seems Juneautown would have had needed strong presence to counteract Kilbourne.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I'm not sure. I think Juneautown Kilbourne Town was mature as well by that point, but Juneautown has always been a little bit bigger and a little bit more mature in terms of its political and economic leaders. But I think Kilbourne stopped being a sectional problem after the formation of the city of Milwaukee in 1846. Prior to that point, he saw Kilbourne Town as the be all end all. But once his city, right, his town became part of a larger city, I think he started seeing the entire city as being his kind of personal province. It's not quite the right term, but I think he became possessive and protective, and of the whole settlement. I mean, ultimately, at the beginning, his goal essentially was something like modern Milwaukee, where Kilbourne Town was the heart of it, right? He wanted Juneautown to be essentially a satellite, kind of like a suburb almost of his settlement. But I think he, like all of the other founders, especially Walker, did envision one large settlement ultimately happening, even from the beginning.
Okay, we have another question. Juneau had 14 children. Any in Milwaukee today, or did they all move to Teresa?
That's a good question. I believe that he still has ancestors in the area, but I'm not sure if it's city of Milwaukee, or if it's greater Milwaukee, or if it's Wisconsin more broadly. But I have heard some anecdotal reports about ancestors of his coming and visiting the Historical Society years ago. But yeah, I mean, unlike Kilbourne, right? I mean, Kilbourne only had one child who survived to adulthood. Juneau had a much larger family, and a larger family tree to this day because of that.
That's our last question. Does anybody else have any questions? Michael might have the answer. Well, if there's no more questions, or I'll let you think for a moment, we did want to let you know that we are recording this presentation, and just like the last one, we will put it up on our YouTube channel. We'll put the link on our Facebook social media so that you can find the link and go to our YouTube channel to view it. Might be another question.
Just thank you everyone for making time today to join this and listen to me. I hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to giving more of these virtual lunch and learns in the future.
Thank you, Michael, for your time today, and thank you, viewers, for attending. We will host another virtual lunch and learn on Friday, May 5th at 12 p.m. The topic for that lecture is "Take Me Out to the Ball Game: Professional Baseball in Milwaukee." Watch for the link in April on our social media channels and our website. Thanks so much for coming. See you next time.
Thank you.